Hello, my name is Kira Karagatsky, and I'm a Patron Services Associate at the Frank L. Weinberg Library in Mequon. I'm here today to talk to you about plant propagation, so let's get started. Plants reproduce in two ways, sexually and asexually. Sexual reproduction includes seeds and pollination, but we're not really going to delve too deeply into that today. Today we're going to be discussing asexual reproduction, which is taking a piece of a plant that exists and growing it into a whole new plant. There are ways to propagate almost any plant, including many of the ones in your backyard. But today we're going to focus on some basic techniques for those plants we commonly keep as houseplants. So each plant has hormones that allow it to grow. And these hormones are concentrated differently depending on the area of the plant that you're looking at. Newly growing shoots contain significantly more hormones than mature stems. So this is the optimal place to take a cutting if you're going to do so. These areas are usually a lighter or brighter green, and they're often found lower down or on the outside of the plant. For example, on this rosemary plant, you can see very clearly the new growth, which is much lighter than this older part here on the stem. And again, on this begonia, you can see that the new growth is more green than the rest of this stuff. It's definitely a different color, and it's more further down on the plant than the other ones. Propagation, or even just pruning if you're not planning on doing anything with the things you cut off, is always going to be beneficial for your plant. The parent plant will trigger new shoot growth in the other areas, and eventually you'll have a fuller and stronger plant. You can see here on this rosemary again where it was cut, and instead of the one growth that was here, it now has two coming out, which is how it gets fuller and bigger. So there are some general tips before you start any sort of plant propagation. For one, you want to choose healthy plants. It's actually pretty easy to tell a healthy plant from a non-healthy plant. And here's a good example of that. Here's a very healthy versus a very unhealthy golden pothos. So you can see that the healthy one is full and firm and upright. It's got really vibrant, beautiful colors. And the other one is kind of droopy and sad, and you can see that it's of the browning and yellowing and looks like it needs water, and just there's a very big difference between the plants. Obviously, taking a cutting from a healthier plant is better because it will mean that your cuttings are more likely to take root and to grow for you instead of just die. You want to propagate a plant during its active growth cycle, which is usually in the spring or the summer, and generally in the earlier part of the day. If you can, fertilize your plant several months before you plan to propagate it. And then a day or two ahead, make sure you water it. This is especially important if you're going to do it with succulents, but all plants appreciate a little bit of an extra boost before you go ahead and start chopping at them. For watering, you're going to want to use either rain or distilled water. The harder your water is, the more it stresses out your plants. Most plants do not fare well with hard water. And the most important part of that water is you want it to be room temperature. Plants do not like ice cold water. It almost shocks them a little bit, and you just generally do not ever want to water your plants with very, very cold water. Always room temperature. Another good tip for propagating is that you always want to take more cuttings than you need. You can never guarantee that your cuttings are going to take root and survive. So if you really want a plant out of it, it's a good idea to take a couple more than you think you want because some of them are sure to die. And the last real tip before you start propagation is that whatever tools you're using, make sure they are clean to avoid any cross-contamination of plants. You don't want to introduce any bacteria or anything like that, especially to your new baby roots that you're trying to have grow. Speaking of tools, there are a few very basic supplies that you'll need to propagate your plants. For the most part, all you really need is something to cut them with, like a knife, like this. Some rooting powder, if you're using it. Some sort of medium in a pot, if you're using a soil, for soil propagation. And then if you're doing water propagation, you're going to want some sort of container to hold the water and the plant. Pretty basic. Knives for propagation can get as fancy or as common as you want them to. There's all sorts of different knives out there that exist for this. There's these knives called grafting knives. We're not going to talk about grafting today because it's a little bit complicated, but they do exist. They're really pretty and fancy, and they come in different shapes. And you could definitely get one of those. You can use one of these beautiful bonsai scissors. I'm a big fan of these. I just think they're so aesthetically pleasing, really beautiful. You can use a simple kitchen knife. You can use a box cutter. I've used scissors. Whatever you're using, you just want to make sure it's sharp and that you sterilize it before you use it. For sterilization, I typically just use rubbing alcohol, rub it on my implement, whatever it is that I'm using. I'm sure soap and water will work just as well, but most people have rubbing alcohol laying around, so you can just go ahead and use that. Rooting boosts. So rooting hormones are a really popular tool that people use when they propagate plants. Some plants don't need it, like succulents. You'll know I've never used a rooting hormone with succulents, and I've read that nobody else really does either. Not really necessary. You also don't typically use them when you propagate in water. There are specially made rooting hormones for water, or else you can use the raw honey method that we talk about in just a couple minutes. But typically, if you're doing water propagation, you're not really using a rooting hormone. They're readily available. You can get them at almost any store that sells plant supplies, hardware stores, local plant shops, online. They're pretty inexpensive. They're not hard to come by. Just really widely available. It's really easy to use it. All you do is, as you can see in this picture here, you have a little bit laid out. You take your cutting, you tap it. This one actually is a lot, but you only really want to get it on the place where you cut your plant. So this person has actually got a little bit of excess. So you typically just want to keep it on the bottom there. And then once you dipped it in there, you kind of tap it on the side to get rid of any excess. And then you just stick it right back in there to your soil. Um, Alternatively, there are some other methods that people have said they've been successful with. One of them is raw honey. You can dissolve some raw honey in some water, some boiled water, and then once it cools, you can use that as a rooting hormone. You can either tap your little stem in there like powder, or you can even put a little bit in some water, and then that's works as well. I personally never used that method, but I'm kind of interested in trying that out, so I thought I would mention it. It's fun to experiment and see if it works. Another method people say works well is cinnamon, and I think this one is mainly for its antimicrobial properties, probably because same thing. 'Cause one of the dangers in propagating is that your little cuttings will get sick. You know, they're brand new and they're kind of susceptible to that, which is why we're keeping everything sterile when we cut them off. And cinnamon kind of helps with that. It keeps from any of that bacteria from getting on there and hurting your cutting. I've also read in a couple of the books that I was reading for research that when you put a pothos is a kind of plant, with with your other cuttings, the pothos will actually stimulate root growth too by something that it releases. This is kind of just something that I've heard, and if you're interested in trying that out, you could try that out as well. So rooting chambers, you're obviously going to need something or somewhere, excuse me, to put your plant cutting in after you cut it. Depending on whether you're doing water propagation or soil propagation, really all you need is a container that holds either water or soil. Depending on how big your cutting is, smaller cuttings, if you're doing soil, they tend not to like big containers. So if you're doing it that way, definitely keep it to around 3 inches. The smaller roots do better in smaller containers. If you put a plant with small roots into a large container, typically it won't thrive in there. But if you can see on the left here, the snake plant was propagated by a leaf blade cutting, which we will talk about a little bit later. And you see that there's a lot of them in there, and that could work because you have more than one. You don't have one little root area. You have a lot of different plants with root areas, so it's not the same as having a big container for one set of roots. It's more like they each have their own little area. Rooting chambers can be as fancy as the ones we saw on the previous page, which are gorgeous, but they can also really be literally anything you have that's a container. As long as you can put either dirt or water into it and then stick your cutting in there, your plant should, in theory, grow just fine. You can see here people have used Literally whatever they found in their house, maybe baby food jars, Starbucks cups, it all works. Um, so it's not difficult to find something to use for a rooting chamber. A fun little quick tip for containers is if you do have a ceramic pot or cup or anything that you want to use but that doesn't have drainage holes, which are extra important in most plant keeping, you can use something called a diamond drill bit to drill holes. They're readily available in most hardware stores or online. They're not very expensive and they're really neat because it allows you to turn basically anything you want into a pot, which I think is pretty cool. Just make sure you don't use a regular drill bit. That will likely break whatever it is you're trying to drill, and that's literally what we're trying to avoid. So definitely don't do that. Another quick tip that I've come across in my research, though it is a bit contentious, is the whole idea of putting either rocks or gravel or some sort of something in the bottom of your pot to aid in drainage. From what I have learned, this does not actually work, and that is because once you saturate your soil in your pot and all the excess water has drained off, your soil is always going to be the wettest at the very bottom because of gravity. Gravity is going to be pulling, and a few other things that I'm not going to get into because it's very scientific, but basically, the water is being pulled down to the lowest part of the pot, which is going to be wherever the bottom of the soil is. So you can see in this one, it's all the way down here. However, in this one, you can see that they had put rocks or something, but the dirt ends here, which just means that the soggiest and wettest part of the dirt is going to be that much closer to the roots. I think the theory in this was that allows your roots to have access to water if you don't water your plant or something like that. But unfortunately, most people are over waterers rather than under waterers, and most people's house plants die from actually too much water. And since that being the case, this is not very helpful to the majority of people out there. If you are very vigilant, it most likely won't hurt. But again, since most people are overwaterers, this causes a lot of root rot and a lot of dead plants and sad plant owners. So generally, you don't really need this if you're watering your plants. It can actually cause more trouble than it's worth. So avoid it. But if you don't want to, don't. It's completely up to you. Just something I thought I would mention that many people are not aware of. So light and temperature requirements for your cuttings once you have them. During the day, your ideal temperature should stay at around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And during the night, no lower than 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, they won't like to be too cold and they won't like to be too hot. And they like what is called bright and direct light. And you can see from this lovely graphic that I found, bright and direct is not right in front of the window or door, and it's not too far away or even medium far away. It's kind of like right next to it, to where your openings are. So if this was a window and you had light coming in there, so the bright and direct would probably be off to the sides here. But kind of that's what you're trying to go for. So definitely don't put it like into full sun. Don't put it where it's really dark. Just kind of off to the sides, kind of by the windows should be great. And then if you're doing tropical cuttings, a lot of tropical plants obviously like humidity. So if you have a really dry house, a lot of us in Wisconsin tend to have very dry houses, especially in the winter. Um, you might want to consider either getting like a humidifier or maybe even like a rock tray that has water in it that evaporates. Plants also, when you have a bunch of plants close together, they kind of create like a microclimate and it gets a little bit more humid in that little area. So that's another thing. You could maybe put your cuttings in an area where you have a lot of other plants, and that could help as well. So as we talked about, there's two ways to propagate, either in water or in soil. And we'll talk about hydroculture first because it's fairly quick and kind of fun. So hydroculture is basically propagating in water. And all you really need to know is you're going to pick a plant, and whatever plant you pick, you're going to look for a node. So first we'll talk about hydroculture, which is really just water propagation. It's pretty straightforward, nothing too complex. Your first step is going to be to take your cutting, the way that that works, and this is for both hydroculture and regular soil propagation, is you're going to look for the node on your plant. You can see that the nodes are these little bumps kind of between your stems or petioles and your leaves. So there on this plant, the nodes are here. On this plant, the nodes are more frequent, like here and here. And as you can see, typically the nodes are where those petioles, those other little mini stems are going to pop out. So what you want to do is you want to cut, for example, if I was taking a cutting from this plant, I would cut it right there. If I was taking cutting from this plant, I would cut it right here or right there or right there. It's really up to you, your choice, how long you want to leave your mother plant and things of that nature, but we do want to make sure you cut below a node. The node is where your roots are going to come out from. So it is necessary. Without a node, you probably won't be able to do it. You want to remove any leaves below the node. So again, if I was taking, let's say I was taking a cutting here and there was like a leaf coming out, I would make sure that all this, I would strip all of this stuff off. And so I would just have a bare stem and then just my node. And then you would do is obviously have a watertight container. Like I said before, your containers can be as fancy or as basic as you want them to be. As long as they hold water, they will do. If you choose an opaque container, meaning one that you can't really see through, you'll probably stem some of that algae growth, which inevitably happens with water culture. But it's not, foolproof, and you're still have to change your water. So again, really any sort of container works. You do want to change your water every so often, kind of keep an eye on it. If it starts to look a little murky or something's off, obviously change it. You want to give it fresh water so that you're not getting any bacteria or anything of that nature in there that's going to hurt your plant. It's going to hurt those little baby roots. So then after you take your cutting, you'll stick your cutting directly into your container with your water. And at this point, you have two choices. You can either leave your cutting in there indefinitely or permanently. People have left cuttings in water for years. I personally have some that have been in there for quite a while. Then you can just keep it that way. You have to keep changing the water and occasionally liquid feeding them, but it's definitely possible. Or once you have some root growth, like on this plant right here on the left, you can take it and transfer it into soil. The one thing that you do need to know is that cuttings that are rooted in water produce aquatic roots. So aquatic roots are a little bit different than soil roots, and they act a little bit different than soil roots. So it is really important that you don't let your roots get too long before transferring them into soil. So like these roots aren't quite aquatic roots yet. It's really technical. We're not really going to go too much into the technicality. All you really need to know is that you want your roots to be about an inch long. If they get too long like this, they've turned, even shorter than this, but they've turned into water roots, aquatic roots, and that's not going to be optimal. You're not really going to want that. So if you do have, let's say you let it go and just forgot about it and your roots got long and they're 3 inches long, all you have to do, roots are actually a lot hardier than we think they are, is literally just cut them back, just snip them off until they're little guys again, let them grow a little bit more until they hit about an inch, and just take it out again and then proceed to plant it in soil like you were planning on doing. So here are some popular examples. Very common houseplants that a lot of people have at home that are being rooted in water. On the left here, you can see the Transcendentia species, commonly known as the wandering Jew. Here you have the heartleaf philodendron, and then the English ivy. And you can see that all of these are in all sorts of containers. A very fancy one here, kind of a basic one here. They're all doing the same thing. They're all making roots, and it works. So this is definitely an option. And that's basically it for water propagation. It's not particularly difficult. You can do it to almost anything. Um, and it's kind of pretty. You can make it look really, really beautiful if you choose to go that way. And it typically works I have only had, I think, 1 or 2 plants fail water propagation, and I've done it dozens of times. So it's actually a really nice, effective way to propagate plants that you have at home. So from now on, we'll be talking about propagation where there's no water involved, and just whatever you're cutting off is going to go directly to soil. And we're going to start with stem cuttings. So stem cuttings are used on most branching succulents or cacti, vines like a pothos or the English ivy, larger tropical plants like this monstera we have right in front of us. Pretty much mostly all the other plants that you can propagate can be propagated by stem cuttings. A quick note here, it's often that plants can be propagated by more than one method. So, for example, monstera here that I'm doing as a stem cutting example can also be water propagated. The rules are basically the same. It's just, what you choose to do with it. So the only note is that succulents tend to be a lot different. So I'll make a point to pay attention to when we talk about succulents. So because they're special. For stem cuttings, you're going to want to look for a stem that's not too old and not too new, kind of how we talked about in the very beginning. So it's kind of, nebulous, but you want it to be bendy, but mature enough not to snap if you bent it. So like you want it to be bendy, but not like too bendy. Thicker, older stems take longer to root because, as we talked about, they have less of that hormone present, the growing hormone there. And they also have a higher chance of failing. So even if it does work, it'll probably take longer to happen. So it's generally just a good idea to not use stems that are obviously old. So again, what you want to do when you're taking a stem cutting or a cutting of any plant is you're going to look for the node. So on this monstera, you can see the nodes are here. This is another one. There's another one. There's another one. And these are actually already roots that have grown out. But so you want to take, so if I was to take a cutting of this, I would cut it either here, or here, or here, or here. But for example, if you had a cutting that was done like this particular leaf and petiole, so this one, as you can see, has no node. So if you were to put this in water, for example, it might live for a while, but this particular cutting will never grow roots because it doesn't have a node and it doesn't have anywhere for those roots to come from. So again, you want to leave some leaves at the top with monsteras. That's not really an issue, but if you had like a more bushy plant, for example, if there's like a bunch of stuff coming out, you would just strip it so that you have a big nice strip and nothing coming out around it. So at this point, you would coat that cut part of your stem in some rooting powder if you were using it, and you would tap off any of that excess. You really don't want any extra rooting powder, it's not necessary. Then you would take your finger or pencil or whatever it is you'd like to use and stick a hole in the middle of your pot with the dirt in it. You want to go about halfway down the pot, and then you just insert your stem right in there. And you secure it by kind of gently pushing your dirt closer around the stem so that it's kind of firmly holding your plant in place. If your plant is too wobbly, maybe too tall, or it's kind of flimsy, you can definitely secure it. You can use a little stake or, depending on the size of your thing, a toothpick or a straw or whatever it is that you have handy just to give it a little bit more support if it needs it. So for succulents, which are a little bit different than other plants, the only big difference is what happens after you cut it. So the cutting is the same. You look for the nodes over here, over here, over here. You always want to cut under the node. You can cut here, but you want to make sure you have that node happening. And then what you do not stick it directly into your dirt. Succulents, you need to have them callus for a while before you do anything further. So basically, you just take your little cutting and you put it in a nice dry, space in your house, and you just leave it alone. You just let it sit there for at least 3 days. I like to do like a week. I've seen people say they do it as up to a month. About a week should do you, 3 days to a week. So yeah, I usually do. I have a lot of success with it, but it's up to you. You can keep an eye on your callus and see how well it's callusing. And then after that's happened, you go ahead and you stick it into a pot. You can see, for example, this succulent in particular already has some roots coming out of those node ends, which just goes to show you that that is where your roots are going to come out. So if you were to cut it like here, you wouldn't be getting anything. You would just kind of be, it would just be kind of a dead plant. So here we have some examples of some pretty popular houseplants that people have these days that look like they've been propagated recently. So this is a monstera cutting. You can see that it's been inserted into the soil. It's got a little stake to prop it up. They tend to be kind of top heavy and looks pretty good. This is a peperomia genus. You can see that they're rooting it in water. You can see these little roots coming out. But the main point I wanted to show you here is that you see that all these places where the little nodes were, they stripped the leaves off, and they, made sure to cut it in the right place. And now it's growing roots. And in a little bit, they probably put it into soil. And because you can see in the back a different peperomia, they tend to be much fuller. So you can see that they took a cutting and then took some of those leaves off so that they could have that in the water there without getting any of that bacteria that we were talking about if this floats in water for too long, the leaves. And then the last one here is a ripsalis. And again, they had taken a cutting, looks like right here, so the node would be like there, so cut like there. And then they stuck it into the dirt, and then that's pretty much it. The next kind of cuttings for propagation in dirt are called leaf cuttings. And there's a variety of these you can do. There's petiole cuttings, there's leaf vein, and there's leaf blade. We're going to talk about petiole propagation first. All petiole propagation means is that instead of cutting the whole entire stem, you cut where the leaves and the little petioles are connected to the stem. So these guys would have had like a big stem right here, and there would have been more of these sprouting off. But so the way that you do this one is you take your cutting as close to the base of the petiole as possible. The petiole, again, is this little mini stem that comes off the leaf that attaches the leaf to the bigger stem. So you cut right there as close to the bottom of that as you can. You want to have about 2 inches of petiole if you can. It really depends on your plant, so but kind of nice to have that allowance there. Obviously, for any of these cuttings, you want to make quick, swift cuts with a sharp implement. You don't want to damage or stress your plants more than you have to. Again, you would dip that little cut into the rooting boost of your choice, and then again, make a hole into your pot with whatever you chose. You stick that petiole right in there and kind of push your dirt around to secure it in there. And then again, if it was flimsy, you could prop it up. This one looks like, I think that looks like it's just good to go. They took the petiole, they stuck it in the dirt, and now they have a bunch of these little baby plants coming out. So the next kind of leaf cutting propagation is called leaf vein propagation. A really popular plant to do this with is the begonia variety, obviously because they have a really prominent vein structure, and they have all these really beautiful big veins that you can use for this. So what you do for this is that you take your leaf and you cut it off the plant, and then you also cut off the petiole. So you can see none of these have those little petioles that we talked about in the last way. And then you have the choice. You can either cut your leaf up into a bunch of little pieces, or you can actually just secure your whole entire leaf to your soil. It's really up to you. But what you do want to make sure is that you have these veins, these big veins in every part. So this one is obviously just one part, and so every part has the veins. This part, each little piece has the vein, and the most important part is to puncture the vein. So if you just have the one big piece, which is what they're doing right here, you want to make sure that you actually poke right through there and like right through there. See how they have a cut here, a cut here, a cut here. So they're cutting all of these big main veins, because if you don't do that, you're not going to spur root growth. Kind of in place of your node, now you have your vein. So the next thing you need to do with your leaf vein cuttings is you need to secure them. You can either, like these people did, you can use toothpicks to do so, or some people take like thin little wires and bend them and push them through the leaves, which works pretty well, almost like a staple. You just really want to make sure to secure your leaf to your medium so that when the new roots are growing, they won't be disturbed by the leaf moving around and shifting. You really want it to be as stable as possible. The next kind of leaf propagation we're going to talk about is leaf blade propagation, meaning you just take the actual leaf and cut it and stick it in the dirt. The way that this works is whatever leaf you're using on whatever plant. For example, this is a snake plant, which is, they tend to have really long leaves, and then, or you could use, looks like another peperomia. They have like circular leaves, doesn't matter. The process is the same. You take your leaf, you cut it as close to the base as possible. You want to take your leaf and cut it into horizontal sections about 3 to 4 inches long. So this would all, like for example, these three, probably all just one leaf, and they took the one leaf and they cut it into 3 sections. And then again, and then they stuck those sections in the dirt, and that's really all there is to it. You can see that they have a lot of cuttings in this one, which is why they have such a large container. If you were just to have 1 or 2 of these, you would have a much smaller container, like we talked about earlier. And that's actually all there is to leaf blade propagation. It's pretty straightforward. Last thing we're going to talk about for leaf propagation is succulent propagation. And of course, succulents are a little bit different. So on the left here, you can actually see these are what succulent leaves look like. They don't look like your typical flat kind of leaf that you think of. They're more these bulbous kind of thicker type leaves, but they are indeed leaves. And what you do for them is whether they fall off or you take them off, you need to let them callus. Succulents always need to callus before being propagated. Otherwise, it just doesn't really work for them. So what you do is you arrange your leaves on your dirt, your dry dirt, after you either take them off or if they've fallen off or whatever it is that happened. And you can either do a very lovely arrangement like they've done here, or you can just throw them down on the dirt. Just want to make sure that they're, not too close, not on top of each other. They all get a little bit of room to breathe. And then you just leave them alone there. Again, 3 days to a week. It doesn't hurt to do it a few extra days. It's not going to go anywhere. So you leave them until they callus thoroughly, and then you wet your soil. And then what you want to do is you just keep it moist. Not wet necessarily. Succulents don't like a lot of water, but you definitely want to keep it moist. You can use a spray bottle. You don't have to. Just take care that you don't overwater and drench your succulents, because they will not survive. And then after a while, really depends on a lot of different things, conditions in your house, health of your plants, etc. But after a little while, you should see all of these little baby plants popping up, and they look kind of like, see down here and down here, just really tiny miniature versions of the whatever succulent you have. And actually, succulents are some of my favorite to propagate, not only because they're so easy to do, because it's so little work. You just kind of plop them on there and just make sure they don't get too dry, but because I personally think that the little baby succulents that come up are just so cute. Just these like tiny miniature version of the parent plants. It's really aesthetically pleasing to me. So they're really a lot of fun to propagate. So here are a couple of popular house plants that you can do with leaf cuttings. Again, on the left here, we have begonias. There's a ton of different kinds of begonias. They're all very, very striking. People typically have used them as outdoor plants, but more so and more so people are using them as indoor house plants. They're extremely easy to propagate. Those very prominent veins are really fun to work with. And they're really versatile, so it's kind of fun to do those. On the right here we got our African violets. These are really easy to do. You just take the leaf, you cut it like in the middle, right down there above the petiole, you stick it right in the dirt, and then you'll get a bunch of little baby African violets coming out the bottom there. It's a really fun way to propagate those as well. So the last kind of propagation we're going to talk about today are runners and offsets. Runners are, you can see here, the most common plant that I think everybody's aware of is the spider plant. And so you see the big mama plant right here in the middle, and all of these little guys are called runners. Typically, these runners, especially when they're this size, they all have these little baby roots coming up off of them at the bottom. So what you can do is you take this long stem that they've grown and you cut that as close to the mother plant as possible. And then you take your other end and you can cut that off as well. And if it has roots, you can either stick it into water to get those roots to get a little bit more developed, or if they're already fairly developed, you can stick them in the dirt and it should propagate pretty quickly. They're really hardy, they're very difficult to kill. So you can easily do that. And each of these plants, you can make dozens of little baby plants, and you can just either give them away or fill up, or you can leave it as is. It doesn't really hurt it, as long as you keep your plant maintenance healthy and you keep up with the soil and the watering and everything. You can see both of these plants have quite a few runners, and they're doing just fine. So either take them or not, but they're really easy and fun to propagate that way. Offsets are miniature clones that naturally emerge from the main stem or below the soil line. So you can see this is the sansevieria or snake plant that we were talking about earlier with the leaf blade cutting, where they had taken this long leaf and just chopped it up horizontally and stuck it in the dirt. However, this one already has a offset. Actually, sorry, this one has a sucker, because suckers are when it is attached to the roots. So you can see that these baby ones are attached to the roots. These are offsets. So these are plant parts that you can break off, and obviously, since this is a cacti, you'll want to let it callus over before you actually plant it anywhere. But so what you would do, like I said, with this one, is just break it off, let it callus, stick it into dirt. For this one, however, you clear the dirt and you cut it as close to where it starts. So between these offsets and this mother plant, there's going to be like a plant material, and you'll be able to see very clearly that, so this will have its own roots and this one will have its own roots, and they'll just be looks kind of like this in the snake plant. And all you do is you just cut right in the middle of that and you separate them. And then these little baby ones, you should be able to transplant into dirt right away, and they will just start growing into new plants. You don't have to do it, but it's kind of fun because that way you can multiply the plants that you have. So again, some popular house plants that you can propagate in this manner. Sansevieria and aloe very frequently have suckers that come out of the bottom. They'll have a bunch of these little babies. So you'll see like a mama plant, and then you'll see a bunch of these little miniature ones growing out of there. And all you got to do again is just pull them out, find the place between the two where they kind of connect, hack right through there, but swiftly and cleanly with a sharp knife, and then just plant in separate pots. And then you'll have a duplicated plant. And here again is a spider plant, or the Chlorophytum genus. And these are really easy and fun to propagate by using their runners, because you can see they're kind of just like running away. So I hope you enjoyed our brief discussion of popular ways to propagate plants that we have in our homes. And maybe you'll have some success using some of these methods at your home. Thank you.